Today we're looking at the Princess Verachantesse eye rig. Why her eye rig instead of one of the other characters? I just redid her eye rig last week and I like the result I'm getting there better than the other eye rigs. So what does this eye rig look like? I've got a a parent bone that is the parent of everything. And if I move this bone, all the other bones, including her eyebrows and a little bone that's kind of at the top of her cheek, right under her lower eyelid, all move or scale simultaneously. This way I can do things like bring her eyes forward or something like that, right? So that's the parent of everything. If you trace any of these bones, you can see back, that'll eventually be, up there at the top of that parentage chain. There's a control that I have floating out here in space that her eyes are damp track to. So how does that work? There's this long bone that's centered at the center of her eyeball that has a damp track to this little green bone, this little green round bone out here. So if I move the green round bone, then just her left eye is moving, right? And this bone is just a child of this rectangular green bone, and this is for moving both of her eyes simultaneously. So that, what happens there is this long red bone here has a damp track to that green round bone with a full strength. And so as I'm moving, you can see that red bone moves at full strength, pointing towards the eye controller. Her eyeball, and there's also an invisible cornea there, are both their parent is this bone. Then the eyelid's geometry is actually attached to this little bone that is also centered at the center of the eyeball, but it doesn't move as much, and it just has a copy rotation constraint with 1/10. And so then if I move the eye around, again, you can see that big long one is moving quite a lot, but that little one is moving at 1/10 the same speed. All these other eyelid bones are children of that. And so if I move her eye, to her left, then her eyelids move a little bit to the left too. And if I move it to the right, it moves a little bit to the right. So that's that I like the look of, and so that's what I do. You can ignore that if you don't like it. So then this bone is actually centered at the center of where her cornea would be if it had its center. It's a little bit further forward than the eyeball because cornea bulges out from the eyeball, right? And we want her eyelids to travel over the cornea, not over the eyeball. So that's why these bones are a little bit forward. These just have a damp track to this control. The control moves up and down. The control only moves up and down as it moves on its x-axis. This bone is turned sideways, so up and down is on its x-axis. And so then the child of this bone that is, a damped track to that controller, the child of that is these three gray bones. They are just children of it. They just move and rotate along with it. Same with the bottom side. But what's going on, when I move this, you can see something else is happening with these red bones. These red bones are anchored here at the corners of her eyes and have stretch to constraints, the proper gray bone here. And so that way, and this is the case with all four of them, there's just a simple stretch to that bone, right? And so that way, as her eye moves, then the corners of her eyes are constant. I had this set up before that only this one would track to the control, and then all these others were a child of it, and that ended up causing lots of problems with the inside corner of her eye, which was awkward, and so I fixed it. The other final thing to note about this is there's a control at the middle of her eyebrows that controls the entire eyebrow. This is a child of that control in the center of her eye, and then these on the outside can be moved independently so that you can get whatever look you find important. You can kind of tweak it and get it looking just right. So then that is about it for how the eye and eyebrows are laid out. Then I also have some copy locations, some transforms, and some action constraints on them so that I can do something like move this eye controller and both of her eyes will move. I can have her wink on one side or wink on the other side. You got to be careful so her eyelids don't go into each other. But you can do that, or you can make both eyes open or close simultaneously. There like that. And then you can also do similar things with her eyebrows, right? I can move her eyebrows up or down, or I can move them into an angry look or a sad look, I guess. And so that is controlled, like I say, done with some copy location, some transform, and some action constraints, which we'll look at if you are not a pro. If you are a pro, you probably get the idea. So go to town, rig up your eyes. If you want a little bit more detail because you don't actually understand how that would work, hang out. Let's look at how these things are set up. So the first thing, I guess, we'll just look at the eyebrows. So the inside of the eyebrows have these action constraints on them. Action constraints let you just say, I want to move one bone, say in its Y location from these two places. And what that'll translate to is an action that these things are bound to on a certain frame. So basically animate her eyebrows going from, say, an angry position to a sad position. And then you take this controller, and as you move it on its Y-axis, you are animating from the sad place to the angry place. So you're just essentially playing back an animation here. And then just wherever that control is tells you which frame of the animation it's going to be on, and the animation is called an action. So that's how action constraints work. You put that on several different bones, whichever bones you think are important. In this case, I have it on all three, right? So I have an anger sad action here. I have another anger sad action here on the center bone, and then I have one here, anger stat action on this side. So, and these are just mean that all three of these bones were part of that same animation. So when I animate her eyes to being angry, then I just move all three bones into a place where she looks angry or sad, right? So that's that. There's also, beyond the action constraints, I use translation. So if I'm moving this one on its x-axis, let's take that, move it on x, that's right and left, right? So what I want to do is have one eyebrow go up and the other eyebrow go down. And so what I do is I have a translation of x going, having it move on its y and z axes, depending on how far this moves on its x-axis. So y is just forward and back, z is just up and down in this case. And so what you do is you experiment with these values, or better yet, just use action constraints for that as well. I won't go into that because the math here is hard, and I end up spending a long time tweaking those to get them right. Again, I would just say use action constraints and say, move eyebrow up, move eyebrow down, and have that control the action constraint for just one eyebrow or just the other, and that would make you a lot happier, I think, than the other stuff. So let us stop there, because really all we would want to do with eyebrows is just action constraints all the way through. But let's take a look actually at this controller that her eyes are looking at. There's actually two interesting constraints on that bone. One is a damped track to her head. What does that mean? That means if I move this controller, say this way, it'll keep pointing towards the center of her head wherever it ends up. See, this is pointing still towards the center of her head, but over here, still pointing to the center of her head. Why is that important? It's important because first let's talk about the limit distance. So limit distance just means it's always that same distance from her head. No matter where I put it, it's on a globe that's centered around her head. Okay, so let's go back to that damp track. So if I move this over here, if I limit distance, it would still be about that same distance from her head, but without the damp track, it would still be oriented so that the left eye controller would be about here, and the right eye controller would be about here, and that rectangle controller would still be, straight parallel to the x-axis, right? And so we don't want that. The reason we don't want that is because if it still was parallel, then this controller would be closer to her head and this one would be further. And then she would be very subtly cross-eyed. And humans are really good at detecting subtle cross-eyed looks, so you don't want that. You want her to only be cross-eyed if you do it on purpose. Like in this case, if I rotate this controller in a bizarre way, then her eyes are like all funky and like, okay, maybe I want that, but I only want it to happen on purpose. I don't want it to happen accidentally. So damped track and limit distance, very important. Let's take a look at the actual eye. So this control has a damped track to the eye look L. That's this little round green bone here. And the other eye, as you can imagine, has a damped track to that other control. So you're going to want one of each. This little bone, the main thing that's important is the copy rotation. It copies rotation at 1/10 strength. It also copies the scale and location of it, just so that if I happen to move this around or scale it, like that little bone will travel along, right? This one, the eyelids, and this is going to be the same for the top and bottom, so I'll only talk about the top, has an open-close constraint. Open-close changes the location of the controller. Its Z location will control the X location of the eyelid. Why is that? Because the eyelid, if I grab it on its X, is moving up and down, where the eye controller, if I move it on its Z, is up and down. So basically, I want it to just copy location with nothing, but because their axes aren't lined up, then this on its Z-axis should control this on its X-axis. So that's what's happening with this transform constraint here. The other thing is the eye wink. The eye wink is the same thing, but because eye winking is I'm moving this control right and left, and I want to move the eyelids up and down. Well, now the axes are matching up. As I move this one on its x-axis, I want the eyelids to move on their same x-axis. So I can just do a copy location with a small amount of influence and on the x-axis, and then I invert it for the other eyelids. So if I grab this eyelid, notice its eye wink, it's inverting on the x-axis, and so that way as I move this left and right, then one eye opens and the other eye closes. So that's what we're doing there. The other thing to note is these three bones are children of this one. So if I was to move this around, those will move along, right? So they're children of it. I can just move them independently, right? I can grab it. This is the parent of the other two. These I can't actually grab because they're connected, right? They can only be rotated. And then the final thing is these are children of that little eyelid center bone, right? And they just have stretch 2 constraints to the gray bones. And I think there's really nothing to add over the quick summary there. You add stretch 2, sometimes it's the head of the bone, head, tail 1. Sometimes it's the tail of the bone. Well, over here, head, tail 0. But otherwise, it's just a pretty generic stretch 2 constraint. I guess one other thing I'm going to talk about here is the eye highlights and her pupils, right? So one thing I can do is I can grab this controller and scale it down. If I do scale it down, those eye highlights get smaller. If I scale it up, they get bigger. And then the other thing is if I grab the little green controllers that her eyes are looking at and scale them, then her pupils will change their size. So let's look at how those two effects are achieved. The first is on the eye highlights. They have a shrink wrap that goes to the cornea, so that actually isn't what makes them grow or shrink. That just means no matter what size they are, they're always going to project down onto the cornea, right? And then the other thing that we have is that the highlights copy the scale of that master eye controller. And so, and I'm going from post space to world space because these are out in the world. They're not part of the rig. They're separate. And so what might happen is you might want to scale the rig, and if you do scale the rig, you don't want those highlights to change sizes as you're scaling the rig. So you do have to mix up your spaces a little bit here. But the general idea is just you're copying the scale of that control. So that makes the highlights grow or shrink. The other thing is the eyeball itself. So the eyeball has some simple deforms on it, two different simple deforms. One is a stretch on the x-axis, and the other is a stretch on the z-axis, and that's just right and left and up and down. And so what happens is the amount of there's a driver on it, and the driver has the amount of that constraint modifier. The amount of that modifier is just the average scale of the eye look bone in this case, right? And so as I scale up that eye look, this goes from 0 to 1, and as I scale it down, it goes the opposite direction, right? So the other trick is it's only on a particular vertex group called pupil stretch, and that means there is just a vertex group which is weighted strong right there around the pupil and weak or 0 anywhere else in her eyeball. And then what that does is means that these deforms will only deform that one little area as in her pupil. And so if I click a rig and click the thing and actually scale it, what happens here is you can actually see the eyeball is being, or not the eyeball, the iris is being scaled, whereas the rest of it around is being scaled a little bit less. And so you want to blend from 0 or from a full weight here to 0 here, and that way it'll kind of stretch between those two, right? And then the cool thing about those is you can go too far, you can kind of go inverted. Ew, that's pretty weird. And then the other thing is you can actually make her iris, like her pupil, bigger than her iris, which then does some weird effect, which I'm not sure I don't like it. I might kind of use this for something one day, maybe a little Shakira Khan or something. So those are all the bones and all the effects that I can think of. So I think we're going to have to let you guys go off and rig your character's eyes. Thanks for watching. Please comment if you've got questions or if you have suggestions of how this could be done better. Have a good one, guys.